She was 20 and homeless. No room, no family, willing to claim her, no plan beyond sunrise. Just a canvas satchel and $31.84 she had saved from washing lunch trays. And with that money, she bought a kid leather glove studio left behind outside Galesburg, Knox County, Illinois, since the county struck it from maps in 1987. The north wall had bowed 6 inches. Half the roof showed open sky. Condemned on October 3, 2001, it was marked for demolition after the spring thaw. But inside the old tranking board sealed beneath a cedar disc no one had lifted in decades, waited a journal, a medal, and $23,530 in forgotten money. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sadie Elaine Mercer had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. As a child, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, she learned to pack quickly. Her clothes fit into a grocery sack, her school papers into a manila folder, and the few objects she loved stayed small enough to hide beneath a mattress. Every apartment felt temporary. She measured safety by how long the milk remained in the same refrigerator. Her mother, Denise, worked evenings at a nursing home and slept through most mornings with one arm over her eyes. She could be tender in private and absent when tenderness carried a cost. Sadie learned not to wake her unless smoke was visible. The one fixed place belonged to her grandfather, Amos Vale, who lived east of town in a white farmhouse with a collapsed windmill and a workshop warmed by a coal stove. Every second Saturday, he drove into town in a faded Buick and took Sadie home with him. He had spent 42 years cutting kid leather for dress gloves, first in New York, then at an Indiana factory after the eastern shops began closing. On those weekends, he taught her to lay a skin flesh side up, find the backbone by touch, and pull the leather lengthwise before cutting, so the finished glove would flex across the knuckles without twisting. She watched his hands use a blunt bone folder to press seam allowances flat. At noon, he sliced apples with the same knife he used to trim patterns, wiped the blade on his trouser leg, and set one half on her workbench. Patience is not waiting, Amos told her. It is keeping your hand steady while the work decides what it needs. Only years later did Sadie understand he meant more than leather. He died when she was 16 after a winter illness that became pneumonia before anyone called it serious. Denise sold the farmhouse within a month. The cutting knives, brass patterns, stretching frame, and Amos's journals disappeared into an auction lot marked old tools. Sadie found one scrap of pearl gray kid leather beneath the bench and carried it folded inside her wallet until the edges went soft. After graduation, Denise's older sister Marla offered Sadie a room in her duplex on the south side of Fort Wayne. Marla kept white curtains labeled pantry shelves and a ceramic bowl for keys that nobody was allowed to move. She spoke softly enough that every instruction sounded reasonable. Rent rose in small increments. Showers were timed. Sadie's refrigerator shelf narrowed whenever Marla was displeased. Nothing was shouted. Control arrived on yellow notes placed where Sadie would find them. On September 14, 2022, Sadie returned from a breakfast shift to find her canvas satchel on the porch beside a cracked blue mug. The lock had already been changed. Marla stood behind the screen door with one hand resting on its brass latch, while Denise sat at the kitchen table beyond, her face turned toward the window. "You cannot stay here after today, Sadie. Leave." 8 words. Sadie counted them, 'cause counting kept her fingers from shaking. She saw the mug's handle had broken cleanly and placed both pieces on the rail. Denise did not rise. She did not look up. When the bus came, Sadie boarded with the satchel on her lap and watched the duplex vanish behind rain-streaked glass. For 6 weeks, she moved by the cheapest routes available. In Fort Wayne, she slept 2 nights in a 24-hour laundromat until the attendant began watching her. In Auburn, she lay beneath a picnic shelter at Eckhart Park with her shoes tied through the satchel strap. A church van carried her to Toledo, where she slept upright in the bus station and spent $4.20 on soup she stretched across 2 meals. She rode west again to South Bend, after hearing of warehouse work, but the position required an address. Her money fell from $31.84 to $18.07, then to $11.62. In Elkhart, she tucked cardboard beneath herself, behind a closed furniture store, and woke to frost on the cuffs of her coat. She learned which libraries opened early and how long one coffee bought a chair. On the 43rd day, rain drove her into the St. Joseph County Public Library in South Bend. She dried her sleeves beneath a hand dryer, then searched the classified pages on a public computer for caretaker work abandoned cabins, anything that promised shelter. A county surplus notice appeared between tax lots. Former glove cutting studio. Structure unsafe. Cash deed. $7. The photograph showed a leaning building under walnut trees and a sign with 3 remaining letters. Sadie copied the address onto a discarded receipt. Knox County was more than 200 miles away. The bus fare would consume almost everything she had left. She sat until the screen dimmed, then opened her wallet and touched the gray leather scrap Amos had cut nearly 10 years before. At dawn, she bought the ticket. By the time the bus reached Western Illinois, only $7 remained between Sadie and the building that had been waiting for her. The bus rolled west before sunrise, carrying Sadie through flat country silvered by November frost. She changed coaches in Peoria, where the station smelled of burnt coffee and wet wool, then rode another 64 miles toward Galesburg, with her forehead resting against cold glass. Corn stubble ran to the horizon in disciplined rows. Every few miles an empty farmhouse appeared beneath cottonwoods and vanished behind her. The driver left her beside a gas station north of town at 4:17 in the afternoon. From there, the county seat was 6 miles away. Sadie walked until the daylight thinned, following the shoulder with her satchel pulled tight against her ribs. When darkness settled over the fields, she slipped through an open gate and found a hay barn set back from the road. The temperature fell to 28 degrees. She pushed herself between 2 square bales, tucked her hands under her arms, and listened to mice working patiently in the rafters. At dawn, the hay smelled sweet and dusty in her hair. She walked the remaining miles beneath a pale sky and entered Galesburg by East Main Street. The town was waking in small separate motions. Doris's Cup and Saucer turned its sign from closed to open. Bellwether Hardware raised a striped canvas awning. Morrow's Pharmacy switched on a green mortar and pestle light. Knox Shoe Repair set 2 Risoled boots in its window, and the Palace Theater marquee announced a Sunday matinee in red plastic letters. Sadie passed all 5 without stopping. The Knox County Clerk's office occupied the first floor of a limestone building whose steps had been worn shallow in the middle. Inside, heat pressed against her face. A radiator clicked beneath a row of tall windows, and the air carried the dry smell of paper stored longer than anyone remembered. Behind the counter sat a woman with a silver pencil tucked through her braided gray hair. Her brass nameplate read MRS, Eleanor Voss, Deputy County Clerk. Sadie placed the printed notice and 7 $1 bills on the counter. Mrs. Voss looked first at the money, then at Sadie's coat, then at the small patch of hay clinging near her shoulder. "You understand the structure has no electricity?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the well has not been tested?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county will not repair the road?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand condemnation transfers with the deed?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Voss removed her glasses and folded them carefully. The skin around her eyes had the fine creases of linen pressed many times. "Most people ask whether there is another property. I only have enough for this one. That was not one of my warnings." "No, ma'am." The clerk studied her for several seconds, then drew a thick ledger from a lower shelf. Its leather spine had split, exposing cords beneath. She found the parcel by section and township, copied the legal description onto a deed form and turned it around. Sadie signed her full name. The pen stopped scratching. Mrs. Voss looked down at the signature again. Mercer. Sadie waited. Your mother's family, from Allen County. My grandfather was Amos Vale. The clerk's hand remained on the deed. Outside the tall windows, a delivery truck groaned through an intersection. Amos Vale, she repeated. Glove cutter, narrow shoulders, always wore a brown vest with one pocket stretched out. Sadie felt the edge of the counter beneath her palm. You knew him. My father did. Amos came here during the summers when I was a girl. He worked in that studio before he moved east. Not every year, but enough that people remembered the sound of his bicycle on the road. Mrs. Voss rose and crossed to a cabinet behind her. She returned with a parcel card browned at the edges. Several names were written in different inks. Near the bottom, beneath a date from 1964, appeared the line, Amos Vale Temporary Cutter, 3 months. He never told me. Men sometimes mistake silence for protection. Mrs. Voss said it without accusation. She returned the card to its sleeve, pressed the deed beneath a brass county stamp, and brought the handle down. The seal struck with a hard metallic snap. Sadie laid the 7 bills flat. The clerk counted them once, though there was no need. She slid 6 into the cash drawer and held the 7th between 2 fingers. For the record, she said the parcel sold for $7. She placed the last bill beneath the corner of her nameplate, rather than in the drawer. Then she wrote directions on the back of Sadie's receipt. Take East Main to Illinois Route 167. Follow it north past Henderson Grove, then turn onto Knox County Road 9. At the abandoned feed silo, take Walnut Spur. The studio stands a little over 2 miles in. You will see the chimney before the sign. Sadie folded the deed into her satchel. Mrs. Voss opened a desk drawer, removed 2 wrapped peppermint candies, and pushed them across the counter. For the road, she said. By noon clouds had gathered over the fields. Sadie followed Route 167 beyond the last houses, walking between drainage ditches, where thin ice held the shape of reeds. At Henderson Grove, an elderly man stacking split oak beside a mailbox lifted one gloved hand. A red hound stood beside him, ribs visible beneath its coat, and barked only once. Walnut Spurs past the silo, the man called. Sadie thanked him. The dog followed her for nearly a quarter mile before stopping beneath a hedge and watching her go. Walnut trees appeared where the pavement narrowed their black branches, reaching over the road. Fallen hulls cracked under Sadie's shoes, staining the wet gravel. The land lowered gradually toward marshy ground, and the wind brought the smell of water leaves and distant wood smoke. She saw the chimney first. It rose from behind a stand of walnuts square, and soot darkened, leaning slightly west. Then the building emerged, a timber-framed workshop, roughly 24 feet wide and 40 feet long, resting on a fieldstone foundation. Weathered clapboards covered most of the exterior, though several had fallen away and exposed gray oak studs. Cedar shingles clung to the roof in uneven patches. The brick chimney had lost mortar near the crown. Above the front door hung a warped wooden sign. Vale and Daughters, fine kid gloves. The first word had been nearly erased by weather, yet Sadie could still read it. The door resisted her shoulder. Leaves had blown beneath it and packed against the sill. On third push, the swollen wood scraped inward with a low complaint. Cold air moved out, past her carrying old leather mouse nests and the faint mineral scent of plaster. Dust lifted in the light from the doorway. Sadie tasted it on her tongue. The front room held a narrow counter, 2 bentwood chairs and shelves divided into small square compartments. Her glove brushed a wall where pale rectangles marked the places framed certificates had once hung. Somewhere inside the building, water tapped at a steady interval. She crossed into the back room. The floor changed beneath her feet, from pine boards to wide oak planks, scarred by generations of stools and cutting tables. A long workbench stood beneath the north windows. Beside it rested the tranking board, thick and dark, its surface incised with curves where metal patterns had been struck through leather. Sadie laid her hand on it. The wood was colder than the room. A rusted stove occupied the far corner. When she opened its iron door, dry ash shifted with the soft sound of sand. There was no firewood, but a stack of brittle pattern paper burned long enough to warm a can of beans she had carried from South Bend. She ate with the can wrapped in her sleeve. Night settled early. The roof whispered whenever the wind crossed its missing shingles, and the loose chimney damper clicked in irregular beats. Sadie spread her coat on the floor behind the counter, placed the satchel beneath her head, and kept the deed inside her shirt. Through a break in the plaster, moonlight formed a narrow bar across the boards. She could smell the walnut trees outside. She could hear water moving somewhere beyond them. Beneath her cheek, the floor retained a faint trace of warmth from the day, as though the building had kept one small measure of it for whoever entered next. The house had been waiting for her. On the first morning, Sadie found the well by following a shallow, stone-lined channel through the weeds behind the studio. The pump handle resisted until she poured a cup of creek water over the leather seal and worked it slowly. Rust-colored water came first, then cloudy gray, then a clear stream. Cold enough to ache in her teeth. She filled a chipped enamel basin and carried it inside with both hands. The outhouse stood 30 yards beyond the walnut trees, listing toward the marsh. One hinge had torn free, so she looped baling wire through the door and post. A wasp nest occupied the corner above the seat, empty for the season, but kept intact. She decided they had built it first. By the third day, she knew the floor's language. A high creak near the front counter meant a loose pine tongue. A dull knock by the stove came from a joist resting against fieldstone. The back workroom answered weight differently, short, dry complaints beneath the cutting tables, then silence beside the tranking board, where the oak felt unusually solid. She needed heat before she could study anything further. Bellwether Hardware smelled of rope machine oil and the bitter coffee Mr. Bellwether kept warming on a cast iron plate near the register. He was a wide man with one pale eyebrow and one dark one, as though two different faces had agreed to share the same head. Sadie set a chimney brush, a coil of rope, and 2 boxes of stove matches on the counter. "I cannot pay for all of it today." Mr. Bellwether looked at her deed, which she had brought because she owned nothing else that proved she belonged anywhere. "You working at the old Vale place?" "Yes, sir." He turned the paper toward the window, reading the county stamp. "I knew someone would buy it eventually. Expected a fool with a camera. I do not have a camera. That improves your position." He opened a ledger marked Farm and Household Accounts. "I can give you 30 days. I may need more. Then make one payment before 30 days, even a small one. A silent account is a dead account." He wrote Sadie Mercer on the first clean line and added the purchases beneath it. Before she left, he placed a stained paperback on top of the coil. "Home repairs for ordinary people." The cover showed a smiling couple standing beside a wall neither of them could have built. "Free," he said. "The advice is old. Gravity is older." Sadie bought only what she could carry, a 6-inch wire chimney brush for $8.75, 40 feet of half-inch rope for $5.20, stove cement for $3.10, a galvanized bucket for $2.40, and 2 pounds of cut nails for $4.65. Mr. Bellwether added a canvas dust mask without entering it in the ledger. Back at the studio, she spread a tarp beneath the stovepipe and disconnected the elbow where it entered the chimney breast. Black flakes fell across the cloth. The first handful of creosote was dry and brittle. Deeper inside it became glossy and tar-like, clinging to the brick in ridges. She tied the brush to the rope, climbed through the roof opening, using a ladder found behind the shop, and lowered the brush from the chimney crown. It stopped after 4 feet. Sadie drew it up, rotated the handle, and lowered it again. The obstruction gave a little. She worked in measured strokes, never jerking hard enough to lose the brush. Each descent released another shower of soot inside the stove opening. The wind sharpened. Brick dust collected in the seams of her gloves. Twice she climbed down to warm her fingers beneath her arms, and once the ladder shifted far enough that she remained still for a full minute before moving again. After 5 hours, the brush passed from crown to firebox. She scraped the remaining glaze with a flat iron tool, vacuumed nothing, because she owned no vacuum, and carried 8 buckets of soot outside. The creosote stained her wrists through the gloves and left a taste like burnt pennies at the back of her mouth. Before dark, she sealed the stovepipe joint with cement and waited until morning. The first fire began with walnut twigs, shredded pattern paper, and one split length of oak given by the old man near Henderson Grove. Smoke entered the room, curled once beneath the ceiling, then corrected itself and drew cleanly into the chimney. Sadie fed the flame another stick. Heat moved slowly through the iron stove first, warming the door latch, then the plate, then the air immediately around her knees. She set the can of beans on top with half an onion Mr. Bellwether had taken from his lunch sack. The onion softened in the beans, and its sweetness filled the room. She ate sitting on the floor. The spoon was cold at first. By the last mouthful, it had grown warm in her hand. That afternoon, she began taking account of the workroom. She found 4 brass glove patterns hanging from square nails, each stamped with a size and a woman's name. A narrow, stretching frame stood folded beneath the bench. 2 rolls of pattern paper had hardened into cylinders, their inked outlines still visible where the outer layers had not mildewed. There was a bone folder polished smooth by use, a 3-pronged stitching chisel, an iron hand press with a flywheel shaped like a small ship's helm, and a wooden mold for forming fingers stained darker at every joint. The last object was the tranking board. It was 5 feet long, nearly 3 feet wide, and thick enough to resist warping. The top had been cut from walnut and cross-banded beneath with oak. Faint curved scars showed where steel dies had been struck through stacked leather. Near one corner, initials had been carved and worn nearly flat. A.V. Sadie traced them with her thumb. She moved the smaller tools to the bench and tested the board's surface by tapping it with the bone folder. Most of the walnut answered with a hard, even note. At the far end, beneath a darkened patch no larger than a dinner plate, the sound became lower. She tapped again. The difference was slight, but exact. Sadie knelt and looked beneath the board. Its weight settled across 2 trestles, each joined with pegged mortises. There were no drawers, no hinges. She tried lifting one end and felt the unexpected drag of something heavier than solid wood should have been. She removed the trestle pegs with the handle of the stitching chisel and lowered the board to the floor. Dust marked its outline. On the underside, beneath a layer of grime, she found a cedar disc fitted flush into the walnut. The grain ran in the wrong direction, making the circle visible only after she wiped it with a damp cloth. A narrow slot crossed the center. Sadie used the edge of Amos's leather scrap first, then stopped before damaging it. She chose a brass pattern instead and pressed its corner into the slot. The disc turned less than an inch. A dry wooden click sounded inside the board. She rotated it farther until the cedar rose against her palm. Beneath it lay a round cavity lined with felt gone brown from age. A canvas package filled the opening. Sadie did not pull it out quickly. She loosened the fabric around the edges with 2 fingers, lifted it an inch, then paused when something shifted inside. The package came free, with a smell of cedar leather oil and the sealed dryness of rooms closed through several generations. A second bundle rested beneath it, then a narrow tin box. She placed all 3 on the workbench. The first canvas wrapping had been tied with waxed linen thread. Sadie cut none of it. She worked the knot loose, pulling each hardened crossing apart with the bone folder. Inside lay 2 crescent knives, their steel dark but unpitted, a walnut-handled pricking iron, 3 brass finger gauges, and a pair of shears wrapped in oiled paper. The shears opened without resistance. At the pivot, a tiny maker's mark showed a fox running beneath a star. The second bundle contained skins. They had been rolled around a cedar dowel and layered with tissue. Pearl gray cream, black and a brown so deep it appeared purple near the edges. Sadie pressed one thumb lightly against the gray leather. It yielded and returned without cracking. The tin box remained. Its lid was secured by a simple wire clasp. Sadie opened it over the workbench, keeping one hand beneath in case the bottom failed. The first thing she saw was a folded letter. Beneath it lay small cloth sacks, a leather purse, a tarnished metal and coins packed edgewise in paper tubes. The weight of the box changed as she removed each object, becoming lighter in careful stages. She placed the letter aside without opening it. The money took nearly 2 hours to count. There were gold, Liberty head, half eagles, silver, Morgan dollars, Barber half dollars, and Indian head cents wrapped in newspaper strips. Some bore dates from the 19th century. Others were newer, though none later than the middle of the last century. The leather purse held banknotes folded into fourths, their paper softer than modern currency and smelling faintly of metal. Sadie made columns on the back pages of the repair manual. She counted each stack once, then again in reverse order. The total came to $23,530 exactly. No cents, no explanation. The medal was a Purple Heart dated 1944. Its purple ribbon faded along one edge. The name engraved on the back had nearly disappeared beneath tarnish, but when Sadie angled it toward the stove light, she could read it. Thomas E. Vale. She sat with the medal in one hand and the unopened letter in the other. Outside evening moved across the marsh. The creek beyond the walnut trees had risen after rain, carrying thin sheets of reflected sky between banks of brown grass. Sadie returned the coins to their sacks and covered the tools with canvas. She placed the letter on the tranking board, weighted at one corner by the Purple Heart. She did not read it. Instead, she walked outside and stood beside the creek until the last light left the water. Frogs had gone silent for winter. A single branch tapped against another above her, slow and regular, while the current passed beneath the bank without asking what belonged to whom. When the cold reached through her coat, she turned toward the studio. One window held the fire's dim reflection. The chimney drew a narrow thread of smoke into the dark. The house had been waiting for her. Morning entered through the broken roof in a pale column and touched the folded paper before it reached anything else. Sadie carried the letter to the front window where the light was strongest. The first line had been written in brown ink, each capital leaning slightly forward. She knew that hand. Amos had used the same narrow M on birthday cards, tool labels, and the single note he once tucked inside her school lunch. She sat on the floor beside the tranking board and opened the page. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the studio has outlasted me, and perhaps outlasted the reasons I was afraid to leave it open. In February of 1987, Dr. Miriam Feld at St. Francis Hospital in Peoria told me I had pancreatic cancer. She was honest about the time. I asked her whether I had months enough to put a house in order. She said I had months enough to choose what order meant. This place began with Silas Vale, born in Gloversville, New York, in 1839. He came west after the Civil War and opened the first cutting room here in 1871. His daughter Ruth Vale Mercer, born in 1868, learned the tranking dies and kept the accounts after his hands stiffened. Ruth's daughter Clara Mercer Vale, born here in 1891, carried the work through the leather shortages of the Great War. Clara taught her son Amos, born in 1925, and her younger son Thomas, born in 1922. 4 generations worked at this board before the final order was completed on October 16, 1955. Thomas did not return from the Second World War. He was killed near Saint-Lô, France, in July 1944. His Purple Heart came home in a cardboard box, though his body did not. Clara kept the medal beside the cutting knives until she died. After the shop closed, I returned whenever I could. For more than 30 years, the rooms remained silent. I repaired what I had money to repair and left the rest to weather. I did not reopen because I had learned cutting, but not courage, and because grief can resemble loyalty when one carries it long enough. The kids' skins beneath this letter are still usable. Dampen them with a cloth, never soak them. Stretch across the grain twice for every pull along it. Keep the room near 65 degrees when cutting. Mix 1 part neat's foot oil with 4 parts clean tallow for the dry edges, and leave the skins wrapped overnight. When shaping fingers, hold each wooden form in place for 90 seconds before moving to the next. Do not hurry the thumb seam. A glove may forgive a crooked cuff, but never a twisted thumb. The money is not payment for finding this place. It is the work of many hands stored in another form. Use only what keeps the roof above you and the tools working. Inheritance is not what a person receives. It is what they are willing to maintain when nobody is watching. Behind the back door, beneath the flat stone marked with a fox, you will find Clara's lamp. Light it before you decide anything. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Amos Gideon Vale, March 8. Sadie read the letter a second time more slowly than the first. When she finished, she folded it along its original creases. The paper knew where to bend. She placed it beside the metal and pressed both palms against the tranking board until the grain marked her skin. Amos had known he was dying. He had known about the studio. He had written to a stranger because he could not be certain the person arriving would bear his name. Sadie opened the back door. Cold leaves had gathered against the threshold. She moved them aside with the edge of her shoe and found a line of flat stones leading toward the well. The third stone was darker and almost hidden beneath moss. A fox no larger than her thumb had been carved into its surface. She knelt and worked her fingers beneath one edge. The stone lifted reluctantly. Below it lay a shallow brick chamber containing a brass oil lamp wrapped in oilcloth. Its handle had turned green, but the glass chimney remained whole. Around the base, someone had engraved small running stitches like those on a glove cuff. Inside, a spoonful of hardened oil clung to the reservoir. Sadie carried the lamp indoors. She warmed the base beside the stove, cleaned the burner with a strand of copper wire, and trimmed the blackened wick until fresh cloth appeared. From the tin box, she took a small bottle of lamp oil packed beside the coins. The first match went out. The second caught. A low yellow flame rose inside Clara's glass chimney and steadied without smoke. It illuminated the brass patterns, the old knives, and Amos's letter, giving each object a narrow edge of light. Sadie sat beside it until the room grew warmer. She considered the kindnesses that had brought her there. Without announcing themselves as rescue, Mrs. Voss had kept the $7th beneath her nameplate and sent Sadie down the road with 2 peppermints. Mr. Bellwether had opened an account in a ledger meant for people whose names belonged in town. The old man at Henderson Grove had given her dry oak without asking why she needed it. A bus driver outside Peoria had waited while she ran across the platform, one hand raised against the closing door. None of them had changed her life alone. Each had placed one small thing within reach of the next. Before this story moves forward, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to. Perhaps it was a meal, a ride, a quiet place to sit, or a name remembered at the right moment. Tell us about it in the comments. Small kindnesses often travel farther than the person who offers them will ever know. That night, Sadie wrapped the crescent knives and brass gauges in Amos's canvas and set them beside her coat. The lamp burned on the floor near her shoulder, turned low enough to last until morning. She slept with the letter beneath her satchel and the purple heart within reach of her hand. The first snow came on December 2nd, 5 inches laid quietly across the walnut roots before dawn. Sadie read the roofing chapter in Mr. Bellwether's repair book 3 times, once beside the stove, once standing beneath the leaking rafters, and once outside with the roof measured in careful steps. The building was 24 by 40 feet, but the pitch and overhang brought the surface close to 1,100 square feet. She calculated 12 squares of cedar shingles, 3 rolls of felt, and 22 pounds of hot-dipped nails, allowing extra for breakage and the north slope where the sheathing had opened. Mr. Bellwether looked over her figures, corrected one multiplication, then reached beneath the counter and brought out a roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle. "My brother's," he said. "He does not need it now." Sadie accepted it with both hands. The old man from Henderson Grove arrived the next morning carrying a ladder and wearing a coat repaired at both elbows. His name was Walter Klein. He had roofed Barnes churches and schoolhouses for 47 years before his knees persuaded him to stop. "I cannot pay you," Sadie said. "Good. Then we will not discuss wages." They worked 11 days. Walter showed her how to sister a sound rafter against one split near the chimney, clamping the new timber tight before driving bolts through both. They rolled felt from the eaves upward, overlapping each course 6 inches, then snapped a chalk line to keep the shingles from wandering. Walter drove every nail in 3 strokes, one to set, one to seat, one light tap to finish. Sadie's first courses rose unevenly. Walter pointed with the hatchet. "That nail's proud." She leaned closer. "Pull it." By the 6th day, her hands moved with less hesitation. By the 9th, snowmelt no longer reached the workroom floor. On December 14th, they set the final ridge cap beneath a hard blue sky. Walter climbed down without looking back at the roof. Sadie did. For the first time, the building appeared capable of keeping weather outside. January exposed what the first fire had concealed. 3 bricks near the chimney crown had begun to spall their faces, breaking into thin red flakes. Below them, the mortar had softened to powder. Sadie could rub it loose with one finger. Mr. Bellwether sold her hydraulic lime sand and fire clay on credit. Walter showed her the mix: 2 parts washed sand, 1 part hydraulic lime with 1/4 part fire clay, where the joints met heat. Too much water, he warned, would make the mortar pleasant to spread and weak when cured. For 3 weeks, daytime temperatures remained in the 20s. Sadie raked each joint to sound material, misted the brick lightly, and packed mortar with a narrow pointing trowel. She wore gloves for hauling, but removed them for the joints, because she could feel voids better through bare fingertips. Every 15 minutes, her hands went numb. She climbed down, held them beside the stove until pain returned, then climbed again. One morning, a repaired brick slipped before the mortar set and struck the roof below. Sadie watched it break in 2, descended, mixed a smaller batch, and began that section again. She built a simple rain cap from sheet metal and bent the corners over Walter's vise. The last joints, cured beneath burlap, kept damp during daylight and shielded from frost after dark. In late January, she lit a test fire using dry oak and a twist of newspaper. The flame rose sharply. Smoke moved through the throat past the repaired flue and drew clean from the chimney without entering the room. Sadie stood outside until the smoke thinned above the walnut branches. The workroom floor was white pine, though years of soot and oil had disguised it. Sadie pulled the loose boards one at a time, numbered them in pencil, and reset them over repaired joists. The original hand-cut rose-head nails could not be drawn without bending, so she straightened each one on a small iron plate and drove it back through its old hole. Mr. Bellwether rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. She began with 80 grit paper, moving with the grain and keeping the machine in motion so it would not hollow the softer boards. The first pass removed dirt in dark ribbons. The second, at 120 grit, erased the worst scratches. The final pass at 220 left the pine smooth enough that the scars remained visible without catching a cloth. Dust entered everything. It coated her eyelashes, settled inside the stove latch, and turned the water in her wash basin the color of weak tea. She wiped the floor with mineral spirits, waited until the wood dried, then applied the first coat of linseed oil with a folded cotton rag. 2 more coats followed, each rubbed thin enough to leave no standing shine. After the third, she barred the door and gave the boards 48 hours to cure. The color shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, deepening around the nail heads and along the paths where generations of cutters had stood. One morning in early February, she woke before daylight and could not make herself lift the sander. She carried her coat to the marsh instead. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, motionless, except for the narrow movement of its throat. Sadie watched until it unfolded its wings and crossed the creek. She did no work that day. The next morning, she returned to the floor and finished the final corner beneath the tranking board. There were 8 windows in the studio. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes patched with cardboard or cloth. The 8th contained one wavering sheet, believed to be original, to 1788, its surface carrying small bubbles and a green tint along the edge. Sadie did not remove that pane. She cleaned its sash in place with warm water and a soft brush, then protected it beneath 2 layers of folded canvas while working around it. For the other windows, she scraped away failed putty, lifted the glazing points, and measured each opening twice before ordering glass. Mr. Bellwether showed her how to roll DEPA 33 glazing putty between her palms until it softened. Press a narrow bedding line into the rabbet, then seat the pane evenly without forcing the corners. She set new points every 8 inches and drew the putty knife in one continuous stroke, leaving a clean bevel that would shed rain. The sash cords had rotted inside the frames. Sadie replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot at the iron counterweight. The first weight slipped and struck the pocket bottom with a blow that shook dust from the casing. After that, she tied every knot twice and tested it before closing the access panel. By the 7th window, the work had become quiet and exact. On the last afternoon, she lifted the restored lower sash and felt cold air enter without rattling the glass. A chickadee landed on a walnut branch outside. It turned once toward her black cap, sharp against the snow, then struck a seed against the bark with 3 small taps. Sadie held the sash open until the bird flew away. 2 winters later, on December 18, 2024, Sadie completed her first pair of kid leather gloves. They were pearl gray, cut from one of the skins Amos had sealed inside the tranking board. She had practiced for nearly 2 years on scraps, making cuffs, thumbs, and single fingers that she later unpicked to study their failures. The finished pair was plain, without embroidery or decorative buttons. Sadie shaped each finger over Clara's wooden forms for 90 seconds, pressed the seams with the bone folder, and left the gloves overnight beneath a clean linen cloth. In the morning, she drew one onto her hand. The thumb settled without twisting. The fourchettes lay flat between her fingers. When she opened and closed her hand, the leather followed like quiet water. She placed the second glove beside it and let the stove burn low. The restored front room held 2 work tables, the repaired hand press, and shelves washed with milk paint. Clara's lamp stood near the window. The old floor retained every dark mark that sanding could not remove, and the preserved pane from 1788 bent the winter light into small, wavering shapes across the wall. Sadie had never discovered what the brass key opened. For almost 2 years, it remained on the mantel, beside Thomas Vale's purple heart. Then, while clearing dead ivy from the largest walnut tree, she found a narrow brass plate fixed to the trunk's sheltered side. Bark had grown around its edges. At the center was a keyhole beneath the same running fox stamped on the old shears. The key turned once. A section of the plate released, revealing a cavity lined with tin. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag and a note tied with blue thread. The paper had been written by Clara Mercer Vale in August 1944, 1 month after Thomas was killed near St. Lo. She had written that the flag had flown above the studio on the morning the telegram arrived. Amos, still a young man, had lowered it alone. Clara could not bear to place it in a drawer among ordinary linens, so she sealed it within the tree Thomas had planted as a boy. The note contained no grand declaration. Clara wrote that her son had hated muddy boots in the cutting room, that he sang badly while sharpening knives, and that he could identify good leather with his eyes closed. She asked whoever found the flag to remember him as a worker before remembering him as a soldier. Sadie refolded the cloth along its existing lines. On November 11, she carried the Purple Heart art and Clara's note to Rock Island National Cemetery. There was no grave bearing Thomas's name, so she stood near the rows of Second World War markers while a cold wind crossed the Mississippi. At 11 o'clock, she held the medal inside her glove and read his name aloud once. Then she brought it home. Of the money hidden in the tin box, Sadie used 4 coins. 1 gold half-eagle helped purchase cedar shingles. A Morgan dollar paid for chimney materials. 2 barber halves bought needles, linen thread, and enough fresh kid leather for practice pieces. She recorded each coin in Amos's journal, including its date and what it had kept working. The remaining money went back into the tin box. Sadie added the repair ledger photographs of the roof and windows, and a note stating that the contents belonged to whoever came next with the patience to maintain the place. She wrapped the box in new canvas, lowered it into the tranking board, and turned the cedar disc until the catch closed. The shop reopened without a sign in the newspaper. Sadie wrote on an index card and pinned it to the corkboard inside Doris's cup and saucer. Hand-cut, kid leather gloves, measurements taken Saturdays, orders completed slowly. Doris drew a line beneath the final word and added, "Inquire here." By spring, the mailing list held 43 names. Sadie accepted only 6 orders at a time. Some customers waited 4 months. None complained after trying on the finished work. Caleb returned one April afternoon on the same Schwinn bicycle, though his knees now rose too high above the frame. A long parcel rested across the handlebars. He had carved a new sign from walnut. The original name Vale and Daughters remained visible beneath the weathering, but Caleb had made a smaller board to hang below it. The lettering was careful and slightly uneven. "And Daughters." Sadie looked from the new board to the faded words above the door. "The old sign already says that." Caleb rubbed sawdust from one sleeve. "It says it once. I thought twice might hold." Together, they fixed the second board beneath the first. When the wind moved through the walnut trees, both signs swung on separate chains, touching lightly at their corners. That evening, Sadie opened Amos's journal to a clean page. She sharpened a pencil with one of the crescent knives and began, "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote about the bowed wall, the first fire, and the day Walter taught her to hear whether a nail had seated properly. She recorded the correct sash cord knot, the mortar ratio that survived frost, and the fact that a bad morning did not always require repair. She did not mention being saved. Instead, she wrote that the building had offered work, and work had given shape to days that once seemed impossible to carry. She wrote that inheritance could remain unfinished without being lost. Before closing the journal, she added one final instruction: leave Clara's lamp where morning light can reach it. The house had been waiting for her. Years later, someone else might lift the cedar disc. They would find fewer old coins, several new tools, and 2 letters written decades apart to people whose names were unknown. Until then, smoke rises cleanly from the repaired chimney. The creek grows loud each spring. Gloves wait beneath linen on the work table, while walnut shadows move across the floor. The kid leather glove studio waits. It has always waited. At the county clerk's office, Mrs. Voss eventually retired. Her successor found an old $1 bill inside the top desk drawer, held flat beneath a brass nameplate, and marked in pencil with a parcel number. No one spent it. The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental.